Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today. We have two very excellent speakers today. Our Executive Director, my lovely boss, Chris Costa, and he is joined by Javed Ali, former Senior Director for Counterterrorism, National Security Council. Ali is an associate professor of practice at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, where he draws on his more than 20 years of professional experience in national security and intelligence issues in Washington, D.C. He held positions in the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Department of Homeland Security before joining the FBI. While at the FBI, he held senior roles on joint duty assignments at the National Intelligence Council and the National Counterterrorism Center, and the National Security Council under the Trump administration. Ali holds a BA in political science from the University of Michigan, a JD from the University of Detroit School of Law, and an MA in international relations from American University. You are so well studied, Javed. He is a frequent commentator across many platforms, and you may recognize him from MSNBC, CBS, CNN, ABC, or his name from the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Hill, or Newsweek. After Chris and Javed speak, we'll turn the program over to your questions. As you know, if you've been here before, please use the Q&A feature to write them in. I will do my best to get to as many of them as possible when we get to that portion, but as you know, we are often overwhelmed. So before I turn this over to Chris to really get this started, I want to thank our really wonderful sponsor, the Honorable Mary Beth Long, who serves on the International Spy Museum Board of Directors, and she is a very, very generous supporter of the museum. So thanks for listening to me. Now over to Chris.
Amanda, as always, thanks for the tremendous introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited about doing this program with Javed Ali. We worked together at the NSC White House for a year. It seemed like it was a little longer than a year, but it was a year. So Javed, I'm really excited to have you. We look forward to the discussion and certainly from our audience, questions and answers. So I'd like to dive right in. In brief, the first story that I've been tracking with great interest from a national security perspective is the fact that the United States once again has briefed allies reportedly on concerns with Russian troop movements on the border between Russia and Ukraine. This continues to be a concern. It doesn't seem to be as disturbing as the troop movements back in April. Still, Russia continues to be threatening in some of the troop movements. So we need to continue, the West, in particular, Europe, needs to continue to put pressure on Russia, diplomatic pressure, to try to calm the situation. And that's really a great segue to the second intelligence story that I found of interest, and that is the fact that the CIA director recently went to Russia. This is the fourth such trip in the last year, actually since July, the fourth such trip of a senior from the administration to engage with Russia. I think that is really important because we have to, the West needs to continue to stabilize an otherwise volatile relationship between Putin's Russia and the West. And certainly Ukraine is concerning, but also Belarus, certainly a partner of Russia. It is very concerning that migrants have essentially been weaponized, although it seems in the last 24 hours, the situation on the ground in Belarus has stabilized, but it can all be seen through the prism of malign Russian behavior. So those are the big concerns I have on kind of a macro level from a national security standpoint since last month. I also want to talk about a counterintelligence story. This shouldn't surprise our audience, but the US continues to warn businesses of efforts by China to collect intelligence, economic information from the United States, from US businesses, particularly critical technologies such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, semiconductors. And more alarming still is the idea that the Chinese government is very much interested in collecting genetic data. And that's important because the intelligence community in the past, or certainly the media, has reported that the Chinese government has used genetic data to track its ethnic minority group, the Uyghurs, which is a concern. Some have argued that genocide has been committed against the Uyghur population in China, so collecting genetic information is a concern. And the National Counterintelligence and the Security Center continues to engage with businesses to protect their technologies from Chinese intelligence collection operations directed at those technologies. So that's a long wind up to say that US businesses have to continue to be circumspect and cognizant of Chinese measures to collect technological data that they hold. All right, so transitioning to a counterterrorism and a terrorism story, which is deeply concerning to me. It was in a Wall Street Journal article. There is no quantification of how many, but several intelligence officers, formers from the Afghan national defense structures, soldiers, some officers have, in essence, my word, not the media's, but defected essentially to the camp of ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan group, an avowed enemy of the Taliban. Why we might conjecture is because ISIS-K is going after the Taliban, and there is no viable opposition movement on the ground that we can view that are opposing Taliban rule currently. So this is very, very troubling that people that worked with the United States, Afghan professionals, are essentially moving into the ISIS-K camp. That concerns me significantly. And relatedly, this should not surprise our audience. In a similar vein, Pakistan continues to use informal intelligence channels really to bolster the Taliban regime, to provide information on ISIS-K. So if you follow the logic, they are clearly aligned with the Taliban, and they want to see the Taliban be successful against ISIS-K, which currently Pakistan considers more of a threat than Al-Qaeda. So this will continue to play out on the ground in Afghanistan, and we need to continue to monitor this. And certainly in future months, we're going to bring in some actors that are very familiar with what is currently happening on the ground in Afghanistan to provide some perspective and color the story a bit. Transitioning to hostages. So for the past 2 years, essentially, I have talked a lot about hostages as we have discussed national security stories. So no different from past discussions on hostages, I want to talk about Jeffrey Woodke. Jeffrey Woodke is an American hostage likely being held by an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Mali. He was kidnapped 5 years ago. Both Javed and I and our team and the interagency team collectively worked to try to bring Jeff Woodke home. Jeff is still being held overseas, likely, as I said, by an Al-Qaeda affiliate. It's believed that he was kidnapped in Niger by an ISIS organization. The fact that he is currently being held by Al-Qaeda, or at least some reporting in the media has suggested that, I think is a good news story in terms of being held by Al-Qaeda versus ISIS, because Al-Qaeda in the past year or so has released some Western hostages, one in particular from that was being held by an Al-Qaeda affiliate has been released back to France. That woman, also a humanitarian worker, is free and back in Bamako, Mali, where she lives. Still, she was freed by work by the Malian government that I have no clarity on. All of that said, yesterday there was a press conference. The Washington Post reported on it very well, that the Woodkeys want to be a little bit more public. They've changed their strategy to get the word out about U.S. citizen Jeff Woodkey, who was there on the ground in Niger to build wells, to build schools, to do good things for the Nigerian people. So all of that said, we will continue to keep our eye on that particular story. Also, related to past stories that we've talked about here on Spy Chat, I think a good news story, just because it brings a modicum of justice. The first Yazidi genocide trial took place in Germany. As a result of that trial, a couple, which has been prosecuted and investigated by the German federal police, was put on trial. A woman who had left Germany, a German citizen, left Germany, joined ISIS circa 2014, 2015 in Fallujah, I believe. She married an ISIS fighter. They took an enslaved child and an enslaved Yazidi woman, slaves that they kept and abused. And as a result of the prosecution, as a result of the investigation, this German citizen went to trial and she received a sentence for 10 years. It's important to note crimes against humanity and the abuse and the death of this girl is tragic, but it's a good news story that they're being prosecuted, and there, as I said, is a modicum of justice. The Yazidis, of course, have been persecuted. Some 5,000 Yazidis were killed in the earliest days of ISIS. We're not sure of the exact numbers, and there are some 2,800 women and children who have been enslaved, Yazidi women and children. I want to make sure, and I don't do this very often, but I want to make sure that our guests have an opportunity to check out a website from the Free Yazidi Foundation that does good work increasing the awareness of the Yazidi population and the disposition of these people. It's a tragic story, but there, as I said, is some justice. All right, the last point I want to make is a book recommendation. Jim Sciutto, who works for CNN, published a book called The Shadow War. The Shadow War talks a lot about the war essentially in the shadows, as the title suggests, between China against the United States and Russia against the United States, the sub-Rosa gray zone conflict that has been ongoing for years. Jim Sciutto does lucid analysis in his book, and I think it really complements many of our discussions that we've had. So those, in short, is a brief summation of the articles, the stories that I'm tracking. I'm going to turn it over to Javid. I'm anxious to hear from him.
Hi, Chris. Great to be with you in this virtual setting. And as you mentioned, we work together at the NSC, and I know you and I have appeared in public events since we both left government in 2018, but I'll reinforce this point I always make when I have the opportunity to be with you, is that I can't thank you enough again for the opportunity to work with you and the team on the NSC. As I jokingly said, I always thought I was the worst qualified person to be your deputy, and somehow you overlooked all my weaknesses and you chose me to serve with you. But it was a tremendously profound year. That's how I've tried to describe it to folks who asked me what it was like to be in the Trump White House that first year. And I learned not only a lot about how government works, but just a lot about myself, because as you know, the job is, as you hinted at, is just so unrelenting, and the pressure and the stress. And
Right.
But we both made it through and hopefully landed on the better end of things. So what I wanted to do today is not, at least right now, directly talk about the articles you raised, and those are all fantastic articles and brought up just a ton of important points across the national security landscape. But I've got a couple of my own that I'll first try to point out or raise some domestic security issues, and then transition to one that's more kind of foreign counterterrorism based, but I'll start with the first. And this is a little bit of self-promotion too. There was a letter that I signed on to about a week and a half ago now that was signed by over 100 senior national security officials. I would not count myself in the upper tier of that group. But still, this letter was published on medium.com last week. And I won't read the whole headline because it's a long headline, but basically the letter was sort of a message to Congress from all these individuals, including myself, that was trying to warn about sort of the threat to or from election subversion and what that means to national security. And maybe another way of thinking about it is that what we've seen now over the past 4+ years, going back to 2016 with Russian efforts and 2020 with things happening here domestically, as sort of this combined pressure of foreign adversaries and now domestic actors and influences, making it harder for us to, as a country, engage in these sort of traditional aspects of democracy, whether that's voting, whether that's other aspects of the election process and systems. And so what this letter tried to urge some congressional action on is to come up with a whole new series of measures to not only combat or roll back foreign influence and interference, and that's unfortunately what Russia was able to achieve in the run-up to the 2016 elections, but also increasingly now, how do we prevent the domestic landscape from also having this negative impact on how we think of ourselves as a democratic country, and again, all these election systems and processes. So that letter, if people haven't seen it, you could find it on medium.com, but I thought that was a really important document, at least for myself to sign up to, because this is an issue that's going to continue to affect us, and we'll see how it plays out in 2022 and 2024 with the elections. And again, it could be this combination of foreign and domestically based influences threatening all these things that make our country great from a democratic perspective. And then another couple domestically focused articles, one from our good friend, both Chris and I, Ellen Nakashima at the Washington Post from a couple of weeks ago, that talked about this fascinating set of developments with one of the Russian-based hacking groups called R-Evil that, if folks remember that name, was responsible for the ransomware attack that disrupted the JBS meat processing company in the summer. And then just about a month later, also targeted another, I think it was a financial services firm in Florida named Costa. And the combination of those two operations from this Russian-based hacking group called R-Evil clearly had an impact here inside the United States. And so based on Ellen's reporting, what appears to have happened is that a combination of US government and foreign government cyber operations have at least temporarily knocked this R-Evil group offline. Doesn't mean it's a permanent ban, because at the end of the day, when you're talking about these criminal hackers, you're talking about human beings. So their technical infrastructure that they use to conduct these ransomware operations, that may be affected, but the human beings responsible for that, they most likely are still operating without any law enforcement pressure in Russia or perhaps other countries where they are. But it's sort of a good news story, at least temporarily, in preventing that group from using, again, that sort of technical infrastructure it had to conduct these ransomware operations. But the Biden administration has also made ransomware threats to the United States much more of a national security priority. And there's a whole series of measures that the administration has taken. But Ellen's story showed a spotlight on that. And then another Washington Post story, and I would argue the Washington Post has done some of the best reporting on the aftermath of January 6th and sort of the fallout and what that means. And here we are now, only about 6 weeks from the 1-year anniversary of what happened at the US Capitol on January 6th of this year, if people can believe that. But this latest Post report from, I think it was last week, was a really good roll-up of the criminal sort of aspect or of what's happened from the legal proceedings to date. So about 650 people charged or arrested because of their involvement or activity on January 6th. But one of the key findings from the post analysis, again, of this huge pool of people who've been charged or arrested, is that the large majority were not formally organized, did not show up on January 6th, part of a group. They weren't guided, they weren't directed. And so from the post findings of the legal documents that are out there, that it was much more organic and bottom-up driven, and that the sort of top-down driven aspect, or the folks who did show up and were coordinating in advance and were conducting what I would argue, and Chris knows this term, is sort of pre-operational activity, that's a much smaller percentage, and fell with people associated with groups like the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters and the Oath Keepers. And that's what this current pool of people charged, arrested, that's sort of the profile to date. And I think Director Wray has already said that even with this really large number of people already under the scope of the Department of Justice and the FBI, that there are hundreds of other people who have been, or who have not yet been identified as a result of their involvement on January 6th. So that number is probably only going to grow, but I'm not sure the sort of profile is going to change versus the bottom up versus top down driven. But that'll be another really fascinating story to watch. And again, the Washington Post has done a really good job of covering this. And then the last couple of stories that I'd like to flag for folks. Another good friend of Chris and ours, Eric Schmidt from the New York Times. Eric has done just exceptional reporting on a US military operation that went terribly awry, unfortunately, in the aftermath of the horrific ISIS Khorasan attack that group conducted on not only Afghan civilians, but US troops who were trying to help with the evacuation of thousands and thousands of Afghans and US citizens in those hectic and chaotic days in August. And if people remember that horrific attack at the Kabul airport, so in the aftermath of that, the military was trying to stop the next wave of potential ISIS Khorasan attacks before all the US troops left and all the US citizens and residents left. And unfortunately, through Eric's reporting, what he's uncovered is that as the military was looking to stop the next ISIS Khorasan attack, that unfortunately an operation was launched that didn't result in the death of the ISIS Khorasan plotters that were probably going to try to conduct the next series of attacks, but sort of an innocent Afghan civilian and family members. And again, Eric's reporting has showed kind of this story in a really interesting light, but also showed sort of some of the unintentional mistakes that were made in the run-up to that, and then sort of the consequences. So this is tragically one of the things that can happen when the US gets involved in foreign counterterrorism operations, is that these, with the best intentions and the enormous amount of capability, we can try to focus on collecting intelligence to precisely target real threats and stop attacks from happening before they affect either individuals in sort of the host country or US personnel or troops on the ground, that things like this can happen. And hopefully there will be some lessons learned from that. And we'll see again what the fallout is, but I wanted to flag that one as well, Chris. So let me stop with that, and hopefully we'll get to some Q&A.
That was great. Thank you so much, Javid and Chris. And we do have some really excellent questions coming in. I did have one follow-up about January 6th, and the fact that this information is showing that it was not as organized as we might have feared. So what challenges does that present for the future? Is it even harder to deal with because it was sort of organic? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in, Chris, and I'm sure you've got some thoughts too. But and we wrestled with this when we were in government, is that this is one of the challenges of the domestic terrorism threat, is that you're dealing with Americans exercising to a degree legitimate expression of constitutional rights, but there's a line where you can exercise those rights, and then there's a line when you cross them then you will fall under the scope of state and local law enforcement or federal law enforcement like the FBI. But this is one of the challenges for why some of this activity wasn't detected in advance in the run-up to January 6th, whether it was bottom-up or top-down driven, is because for the most part, at least at the federal level, as Chris knows, the FBI just can't watch passively social media activity to look for people who might cross the line into violent action. It's only when they cross the line can then at least the FBI sort of get involved. And this is the way our sort of legal framework works for the collection of domestic intelligence here. Now, if people want that framework to be changed, there are consequences to that. And again, these are all policy choices we need to think through as a country. But this is one of the reasons why domestic terrorism is so much harder than even the challenges on the foreign terrorism side, is dealing with Americans who can exercise their rights all the way up to a certain line before they cross them.
Oh, Chris, you're muted.
I swore that would never happen to me ever again, but sorry about that. So Javed did a great job of really articulating the law enforcement challenges. I'll take folks back to Charlottesville. I was in the White House. Javed was there. We monitored very closely the events that were taking place, but clearly from an NSC perch that there were many domestic responsibilities that were purely in the domain of law enforcement, federal and state. All we could do is monitor and ensure that Homeland Security bulletins were disseminated widely, et cetera. So there was a spontaneous reaction during the event. It was a horrific killing. That individual was not charged for domestic terrorism or any statutes associated with domestic terrorism, but instead, federal crimes, and I think some federal hate crimes and state crimes. But the bottom line is the individual used a vehicle as a weapon. It was investigated fully and completely. And really that set conditions once again for the NSC in its role from a policy standpoint to monitor, ensure law enforcement has the appropriate tools. I was not, nor was Javed, at the White House monitoring events leading up to January 6th, but a couple points can be made. First and foremost, January 6th has to be investigated. It has to be a bipartisan, apolitical investigation, that we have to identify any actors that truly were trying to inspire political action that would turn into political violence. That said, we also, the United States in particular, has to ensure that we do not politicize some of the acts that took place that day. We ensure they're investigated, individuals are charged and investigated and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. We don't want to politicize some of the crimes that were committed that day. All of that said, the United States is so polarized that it's really hard to get us to a place where there'll be an understanding and acceptance that the United States has a responsibility to prosecute individuals. And we also similarly have the responsibility to ensure that individuals have the right to protest, the right to express themselves. It's just they cannot cross over that threshold from peaceful expression to political violence. So that's how I would address that excellent question.
And Amanda, can I just jump in and just add a couple points to what Chris said too? And again, even if you look at the fallout from January 6th, and again, this enormous amount of people who've been charged, this is another issue we have to wrestle with as a country. No one has been charged, and even the people who've been sentenced and are serving prison time already, no one has been charged with a terrorism crime, because we have a definition of domestic terrorism under the Patriot Act, but there's no crime of domestic terrorism. And so this is why all the people who've been charged today have been charged with other federal crimes, but the word terrorism doesn't show up, even though it is January 6th as an event is talked about by Biden administration officials and others as an act of domestic terrorism. So this is one of the paradoxes of this issue for us here in the United States.
And just one other important point, if the United States intelligence community, the FBI, actually the law enforcement community, identifies the individual that was videotaped that had presumably a pipe bomb, if that individual is identified, he will be charged with domestic terrorism related charges. But all of that said, Javed is exactly right with that nuance of the statute and domestic terrorism versus other charges. Great question.
Yeah, yeah. Kind of adjacent to that is a question about, do you see technology being a major barrier or an advantage for domestic security?
I mean, I would argue it's an advantage, but again, it's a double-edged sword, right? So on the one hand, if we're going to ask Homeland Security and FBI and other players in the domestic law enforcement or domestic security space to build up their capabilities to start getting ahead of this threat inside the country, and technology is clearly going to be one of the things that assists on that front, that will, again, potentially come at a cost too. And what's the line where now armed with these new capabilities to look at more information or more data that's just out there in the public domain, how close to the line will DHS or FBI or others who start doing more on that get to the line they're not supposed to cross, right? We're infringing on people's civil liberties and civil rights. And we've had this tension in the United States in our history in the past, in the 60s and 70s. And some of the biggest critics of having FBI or DHS doing more on sort of the information gathering or analysis side to combat, this rising threat here are privacy groups, civil liberties groups, because again, they'll go back to the history books and said, well, if you look at what happened 50 years ago, those weren't good news outcomes either, right? So again, there's always a tension in the system, but we just have to weigh the pros and cons and then kind of make the right policy choice.
Yeah, I agree with exactly what Javed said. It is, in fact, double-edged. And I'll just provide an example. We kind of alluded to it when we talked a little bit about the Uyghurs. Facial recognition technology, that's going to help from a defensive standpoint to protect our borders down the line, to identify someone that might be wanted by federal law enforcement. But at the same time, we already know that China has used facial recognition software to track Uyghurs' movements and prevent them from going to certain places that are restricted in China. So technology always is a double-edged sword.
A quick factual question about January 6th. I don't know if either of you know this. Do they know how many people had guns entering the Capitol?
Yeah, someone would have to go back and either look at the Washington Post reporting or this body of information that the Department of Justice has very transparently sort of put out there on the DOJ website. But I'm not sure that many people have been charged with the actual sort of a crime of bringing a weapon unlawfully into the Capitol premises. Now, I used to be a briefer to Congress a lot when I was both in Homeland Security and FBI. And every time I would go in as an intelligence briefer, you're going through a metal detector, right? Even if your phone goes off, I mean, that's going to flag something. So I can't even imagine like what it would have been, like what someone's mindset would have been to bring a loaded weapon onto the grounds of the Capitol and then try to get into the building. I mean, that presents a serious threat to people inside. But how many folks actually did that? I just, off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, nor do I, but it's an important question.
Well, it's interesting here, the perspective from you who have both been there to give briefings. So changing gears slightly, your thoughts about the recent FBI statement on those fake emails from the law enforcement enterprise portal. Who hacked the system? How did this happen? Any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, it's just another example of the vulnerabilities we face on the cybersecurity front, and even the agencies that, like FBI, that have a serious and significant role in, one aspect of federal cybersecurity, anyways, unfortunately their vulnerabilities. And just like in counterterrorism, where it's a game of offense and defense, and just when you think you've mitigated your gaps and your vulnerabilities and one aspect of your security posture, then the adversaries, as Chris and I would say in counterterrorism, they always get a vote too, right? They're smart, they're adaptive, they're flexible, and they will keep probing and looking for ways to get in or exploit your defenses. Now in the cyber world, the defenses are digital, not physical. But clearly some group, whether it was a hacking group or a foreign state-backed adversary, they were able to get into the FBI sort of digital space. Now, we don't know the method, or at least I haven't seen the method. Was it a spear phishing email? Was it a malware operation? I'm not sure, but if that could be forensically pulled apart, that would lead to some interesting insights as well.
Yeah, I have nothing further to add on that, Amanda. Javed did a great job of addressing the question.
Here's a scary question. Speaking of Chinese efforts to collect genetic data, do you think these might be part of an effort to create biological weapons that can target specific people? And it sounds like a movie, doesn't it? But I hope we don't have to live it.
So I'll just jump in there. I don't have the scientific background to understand, the genetic, the genetic codes and how they can be affected and where technology and science is right now. But I have read that there, again, herein lies the challenge. There is the idea that if you understand someone's genetic code, you can get ahead of some diseases that they may very well suffer from. And there are things that can be done preventative, but at the same time, yeah, you could potentially take elements of your population and make them maybe impervious to some kind of infection or virus that could be weaponized. So I think that's all in the realm of the possible. And I've seen some writings on this. I am certainly not steeped in these questions, but it is frightening. And there will have to be conventions. There are conventions for, biological weapons. That's not to say all countries adhere to those respective conventions, but science is going to demand that kind of attention as well. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Javed?
Well, despite the fact that both my parents are medical doctors, I was a solid C student in high school biology, so I don't think I'm equipped to answer that. I think Chrissy did a good job with your response.
Great. Then this changing tracks. Is there a potential upside to the defections of officers to ISIS in Afghanistan? Can this weaken the Taliban's grip? Are there other ways to lessen their hold?
Yeah, so I'll jump in there and I'd love to hear Javed's perspective. So I've thought a lot about this particular question, and I cheated and looked ahead and saw that question, and I jotted down a few notes. First and foremost, the United States, in my humble opinion, and Western countries need to ensure that the Taliban disavows their ties to Al-Qaeda. That will make future diplomatic recognition possible. Currently, the United States is engaging with the government of Qatar. They're tremendous partners to the United States, and they will be able to act, as I understand it, as an interlocutor as we engage through them to the Taliban government currently at hold. So what's the upside? What is the upside of some defectors moving into the ISIS-K camp? I can see no upside to that, because ISIS-K are adversaries to the United States. They're actually adversaries to Pakistan, and they're a threat to the region. So they are clearly, unequivocally terrorist, bad actors that would like to establish a regional caliphate. So think about Iraq, circa 2014, 2015. So they will continue to pose a problem. At the same time, the United States clearly is concerned about Al-Qaeda, who are aligned to the Taliban government. So there is no opposition group that the United States is in a position to arm and train and work with. First of all, we should step back at a macro level and consider there is some goodness currently with what's playing out on the ground in Afghanistan, notwithstanding that there is the potential for a humanitarian crisis, which will need to be addressed, probably in short order. But there isn't whole-scale violence playing out right now on the ground in Afghanistan, at least not from the reporting that I'm seeing. But the United States has a dilemma. You know, if they recognize the Taliban at some point down the line, the Taliban are linked, protect, and there are past Al-Qaeda operators, the Haqqani network, surrogates, proxies, however you define it, that are part of the Taliban government. And that is completely untenable. But at the same time, I don't see any past actors that were trained by the United States government or worked with the United States government, worked with the Afghan government that are aiding ISIS-K. I don't see any upside to that dynamic, candidly. I think it's very complicated and complex, and it's just not good.
Yeah, I would underscore Chris's points that, I mean, this is a obviously very complex situation right now in Afghanistan, but again, going back to these sort of tough policy choices and trade-offs sometimes we have to make as a country. This is sort of the reality of the situation. The Taliban's in control, and ISIS Khorasan presents, I would argue, and I think that's Chris's point too, this is the bigger threat to local security in the country. ISIS Khorasan has been active in Afghanistan for several years. Prior to the events of this summer, I mean, they had conducted a series of, you know, dozens of horrific attacks inside the country. So it's already a serious threat inside in the country. And now that the landscape has changed politically, it's in the US interest, I would argue, to keep pressure on ISIS Khorasan, whether that's by extension through the Taliban, whether it's through our own unilateral capabilities, whether that's in partnership with other regional actors. But ISIS Khorasan presents the greater threat, again, not only locally, but regionally, and hopefully not transnationally. That's the thing that no one wants to see happen again in Afghanistan, for it to be a launch pad for external operations against the West, or worst case, the United States. So this is a part of the world where the United States still needs to maintain some focus from a counterterrorism perspective, from an intelligence perspective, even though we don't have the same presence we did from the last 20 years. And I would argue again that ISIS Khorasan presents the biggest threat currently.
Staying with that area of the world, what role do you think Pakistan is playing in that region, you know, relevant to what's happening in Afghanistan?
So I can jump in there, give Javed just a moment. I would offer that what Pakistan is doing is what they did consistently for the past decades. They are going to surreptitiously and beneath the radar, they are going to continue to support the Taliban. It is in the interest of Pakistan to have a more stable Afghanistan. So they're going to provide support to them. They're going to provide intelligence in some way, shape, or form to the Taliban against ISIS-K. They're going to support the Taliban to the extent they can. They've done that for decades. They are going to continue to do that. And to Javed's point, they're more concerned in the short term about ISIS-K. But there've been some pieces that have been written about the hand that bites you. And the Taliban is also, at least by extension, the Taliban in Pakistan are threatening to the very Pakistani government that supports the Taliban in Afghanistan. So as we have talked about, it is complicated, but it is not hard to understand that the Taliban would consider, you know, their spiritual brothers, the Taliban, and they will continue to support the Taliban beneath the radar, in some cases less more overtly in the future as the Taliban stands up a government.
Yeah, I would also agree with wholeheartedly with Chris on that point. And I do think the relationship has moved from the shadows, as you described, Chris. It's more out in the open now, right? Where because the alignment of the interests of Pakistan and the Afghan Taliban are in lockstep for the most part. Now, the interesting question beyond Pakistan is how does that then shape regional security with India? How does China look at this? How does Russia look at this? So these are all open questions that we don't have answers to right now. But yes, there is a Pakistan piece of this, but there are all these other regional players that are also looking at events on the ground in Afghanistan and seeing how does that align with their interests or not, and how will they maneuver going down the road.
All right, I have a question I very dearly love because I ask it a lot, but it's not for me. One of our guests wants to know, is Chris going to write a book about his years in the White House?
Well, I am not going to write a book about my time in the White House, not exclusively. Maybe someday I'm thinking about writing a book on national security and leadership. And certainly I want to talk about the work at the White House, but I will maybe disappoint some because I don't intend it to be a tell-all. It would be a professional narrative on the kind of people that worked with me at the NSC. And I think it's an extraordinary story. We can provide some insights on how we managed a very, very, I don't use the word chaotic, other people do, but it certainly was a fascinating and interesting and high pressure environment in the first year of the Trump administration. Truly, any administration the first year is challenging, but I would like to share the story someday, some way. And agents have talked to me about potentially writing a book, but I made it clear that it won't be the book that is the tell-all. I won't give up any secrets. It'll be responsibly done. So therefore, maybe people won't want to read it. I don't know, but we'll see. Maybe Javed will write the book.
Yeah, trust me, I'm not writing one either. But what I always find so fascinating when I have time to reflect on that year we spent is that going back to my joke, although I don't think it was really a joke, it was more an honest self-reflection that I had spent my career prior to working at the NSC supporting that very office, even pre 9/11 as a contractor. And then all the way through in those 15 years after 9/11, I knew everyone in that office, all the senior directors and the different folks who were working there at the staff level. But my role was always to support the work they were doing because I was on the intelligence side of the equation. And I was comfortable on that side. And my one takeaway every time I would go to the White House, and I was there all the time before I worked in the White House, was, gosh, that job seems really hard. And I don't think I've got the skill set to be proficient. And then when, again, Chris selected me, and Chris and I didn't know each other either, which was also pretty interesting. The first 6 months, and I tell my students this now in the classroom, that I felt like I was such a fish out of water because the policy world to me was just so different. And I had a really hard time, just at an individual level, kind of wrapping my head around these complex counterterrorism policy issues and thinking through the options and what are the strengths and weaknesses. It wasn't me individually, but with the team. But I would say that was definitely something I was not very good at initially, and perhaps even throughout the full year that I was there. But it pushed me so outside my own comfort zone as a counterterrorism professional. And hopefully I learned a lot through that process. Again, not only how our government works, but just who I was as a professional and as a person as well. So it was a tremendously fascinating experience, but you can only do a job like that for so long. And one of my jokes too, and I tell my students, it was a year, but it felt like 20, just because the pressure you feel there is unlike any other position I had in my government career.
Well, here's a question for both of you about your time working at the White House. Can you comment on the Steele dossier, which is really, coming under fire? And did it affect your work in the White House?
So I can answer this question unequivocally, no. I always say the best meeting that I never took was with the Russians. That's a fact. So we had no interactions with Russia. We stayed out of Russian matters. And that's really underscores our focus in our directorate was protecting the United States from a terrorism attack, protecting our allies and friends and partners overseas from a terrorist attack, trying to recover US hostages and other partner hostages from other countries. We stayed out of politics and Russian matters, and mercifully so, right? None of us, to my knowledge, were investigated. None of us were questioned, and we had no visibility on that. And as the senior director, I would have had a sense for whether we were traveling and or navigating, difficult shoals on that score, and we were not. We had no issues related to the Steele dossier or Russia for that matter. I will say it just underscores the importance of staying apolitical, not politicizing a story, as unsavory as it is. And I really have a lot of faith in the press, notwithstanding some problems with how the Steele dossier was reported. There have been some significant retractions in coverage. All of that said, the truth will eventually come out, and I'm anxious to understand and comprehend the whole story. But it's important for the press to get it right and to report on these kinds of things. So that's how I would address it. Unless Javid knew something I didn't know in the directorate, we avoided the politics of that story.
Well, I was always the last to know, usually everything, right? So again, luckily, we had no insight on that whatsoever. And, underscoring another one of Chris's points, that was such a remarkable thing to see in the year that we were there, is that we tried to stay out of the political sort of tug and pull that normally happens in every White House. And I think we did a really good job of that. Didn't mean we didn't have brutally difficult and tough conversations on policy. We did, and Chris knows exactly what I'm talking about, but we stayed out of politics. And what I thought was really interesting, I would go home and, you're working 12, 14 hours every day, you leave and you go home. And Chris and I, because of our positions, we were also in the West Wing a lot. And I almost always had no idea what was happening politically until I went home and saw what was being reported in the media. Like, even though we were across the street and in the White House environment itself, we were shielded for the most part from all the political things that were happening, either on the foreign side or domestically. And again, I think that was the testament and strength of the NSC. And we had a leader like General McMaster too, who made sure that we didn't kind of get sucked into that.
If I could just follow up on another point, I think it's great for our audience to know. So I'm really having fun with this conversation. So I want to emphasize a point, and Javid knows the story. I probably won't tell it, of Thanksgiving in our year in the White House and concerns with threat. But I asked Javid in most cases to run our threat video teleconference where we shared all intelligence on threat streams across the planet that were related to terrorism. And we did that with the entire counterterrorism enterprise, as well as foreign partners. And the audience should be encouraged to know this was policy, but it was the real life 24. There are intelligence officers out there taking significant risks collecting the intelligence. Our role was to ensure that something happened with that intelligence. That was the real world 24, that we ensured that from the perch at the White House, we could use the bully pulpit as officers for the President of the United States to ensure that something was done to mitigate those threats. And I very much appreciate, and I don't think I've ever talked about it at a spy chat, that we did that video teleconference with our entire team once a week and the interagency, but that kind of work plays out day in and day out at the NSC. That's why it's very hard for me to have a critical view of the actors that are currently in the White House, in the Biden White House, because I'm not there. I'm not wearing their shoes. I'm not seeing the intelligence. I'm not seeing the threats that don't manifest themselves. And in many cases, it was Javed leading those discussions. He had a history of being an analyst, and I was very comfortable with him running the meetings. There were plenty of meetings that I ran. So, we did the job of mitigating the threats. And I really wanted to share that with our audience, because we don't often have an opportunity to talk about how the policy leverages the intelligence and how we mitigate threats.
We have a question that we like to get, but it's got a special tweak. We often get asked about careers in intelligence, but this person particularly is interested in a career in intelligence policy. Any tips for how you would get involved with that?
So I would say, first and foremost, chase your dream. It is absolutely doable, because I never expected to be at the White House a policymaker. Do it when you're younger is some additional advice. I wished I was 35 when I was at the NSC. Of course, I wouldn't have had all the experiences I could draw upon, but chase your dream. You work at a think tank, get a graduate degree, try to plug in, network aggressively, come to the Spy Museum, understand the difference between policy and being an intelligence practitioner, and ultimately remember that the intelligence community exists to support policy. So pursue your objectives, engage with the think tanks, read everything you can get your hands on, tell people, find a mentor, and be a protege to somebody that can help guide you and provide you feedback. And as I said, just be a great student, but start a whole lot younger than I did.
Yeah, Chris and I were, we both went into the White House with gray hair, just came out with even more gray hair, I think, after that. But, getting to your point about careers, another thing that I think is really important, in order to be an effective policy expert, and whatever your topic is, whether it's intelligence or anything else, I do think you need to have some expertise in that walking in the door, right? Because what I saw with folks who were policymakers who didn't really understand, the nuts and bolts of the business from, whatever the functional or regional issue was, that could be a little bit of a drawback. And so just a great example of the diversity of the folks in our team. So Chris spent his career in the military and was on the operational side of things. My career was the complete opposite. It could not have been more opposite than Chris's. I spent 20 plus years in Washington. All of that time was as an analyst, either in government or outside of government. But the complement of our two backgrounds and our skill sets in counterterrorism, I think, played off each other. So, and that was a really interesting way to build a team. And then, as Chris knows, and we had so many career professionals who were at the director level, and they all brought their own individual experiences as well in different aspects of counterterrorism. So I do think that's important, because without that experience, it would be really difficult to think about making or developing policy if you don't know, again, what the nuts and bolts of the business are.
All right. Well, thank you both. It was not hard for this hour to pass by with such interesting conversation. Chris, do you want to say anything before I wrap this up?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Javed, and thanks to the tremendous spy team. I want to wish everybody a happy holiday, and I want to ask people to check out the site on the Yazidis, educate yourselves on how they've been persecuted as an ethnic people. And also, I wanted to highlight that Missy Ryan wrote the Washington Post piece yesterday on Jeff Woodkey. I would keep him in your thoughts and prayers. And again, we want to bring Jeff Woodkey home. He's been held by Al Qaeda and ISIS affiliates for 5 years. It's almost unbearable to process that.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris. And so as we are celebrating our American Thanksgiving and giving thanks, that's a good time to think about others who are not so lucky and to see how we can help. Thanks everyone for being here. Our next public virtual program will be another Spy Chat, and that will be on December 9th with Sue Gordon. And in the meantime, if you want to see what's going on or visit the Spy Museum, you can hop on our website and look at our events coming up. We have a wonderful event for families with members who have autism on Sunday, very special Access to Spy Day. And so we thank you for your support. We want to thank Mary Beth Long for her amazing support of the Spy Chat series. And if you would like to support us individually, you know you can do that too on our website. We appreciate all your contributions, and everyone have a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you, everyone.